Yes.
Robert, I think we will start by asking you to give an account of your latest of so many books.
Well, I think I'll back up actually to bring us directly to analytic philosophy. The just previous book was called The Fate of Analysis, and it was an historical description and critical analysis of the analytic tradition. And in that book, I distinguish between two phases of analytic philosophy, what I call classical analytic philosophy from the late 19th century to 1950, roughly after the Second World War, 1950, and then the second phase, which I dub post-classical analytic philosophy from 1950 until the present time, 6 a.m. this morning. And in classical analytic philosophy, it seems to me there is a genuine project there, which is a logicist project about the reduction of mathematics to pure logic. There's a clear commitment to the very idea of a pure logic. There's also a clear commitment to the idea that there's one and only one fundamental kind of necessary truth, namely logical truth, which is the same as analytic truth. And also that all a priori knowledge is knowledge of analytic truths of either a purely logical sort or using extensions of logic, propositions into which we have insight into their pure meaning units, and then various meanings are reducible to those meaning units. And I think that project was finished by 1950 for a variety of reasons. The collapse of logicism, but also through Gödel's incompleteness theorems and Tarski's work. And together with those, Quine's attack on the analytic synthetic distinction, two dogmas of empiricism, his earlier from the 30s attack on the conventionalist theory of logical truth. And so that whole program had dissolved, I think, had fallen apart. And yet analytic philosophy continued to roll on. And so when I started working on analytic philosophy, on phenomenology, and asking myself what kind of a philosopher I was or was going to be, it seemed very puzzling to me that the analytic tradition just keeps rumbling on, and exerts a genuine dominance over professional philosophy. In a most recent survey from 2020 or 2021, 80% of professional philosophers said that they're analytic philosophers, and yet they don't agree with logicism. They don't necessarily agree that all necessary truth is logical truth. And so I asked myself what holds them together, and it seems to me there are two things that hold them together: a dogmatic commitment to scientism, the epistemic and metaphysical valorization of natural sciences, but also the formal sciences, and also a commitment to a broadly mechanistic picture of the universe, a reductive, mechanistic, and materialistic picture of the universe, both of which I think are more dogmas, so dogmas of post-classical analytic philosophy, and not ultimately defensible. And so I set out to ask myself how the analytic tradition came about, what its character is nowadays and where it's going. And my historical analysis was that both the analytic and phenomenological traditions grew out of neo-Kantian, but also post-Kantian, Kantian philosophy ultimately, and consisted mainly in a reaction to the dominance of professional philosophy by the neo-Kantians, and a claim that neo-Kantian philosophy and Kantian philosophy and idealistic philosophy were mentalistic in a false and self-undermining way, and so fell into the sin of psychologism. And then I set about to, as it were, not just as it were, but to reinterpret Kantian ideas and test them against the arguments of analytic philosophers. And I came to the conclusion that analytic philosophy nowadays is mainly a social institutional fact. They dominate. They're obviously strands of influence, students of students of students, going back to the trinity of Frege, Russell, and Moore, or something like that. And they, methodological similarities, particularly use of logic and a commitment to logical thinking. At the same time, the analytic tradition doesn't have an adequate account of the nature and status of logic. And there are various problems arising from the fact that in order to justify or explain logic, logic must be presupposed and used, this so-called logocentric predicament, which I don't see analytic philosophers have solved. And so what I set out to do was to provide a new and broadly Kantian approach to the same set of issues. And then I concluded that somewhat overconfidently, perhaps, that the analytic tradition is going down into the ash heap of history, and that the only way forward for philosophy is a renewal and a rethinking of Kantian philosophy. So my slogan, the slogan of the neo-Kantians, was back to Kant. My slogan is forward to Kant. So a new renovated Kantianism.
So maybe if I can comment on two things. So the renewal of analytic philosophy after the breakdown of the Vienna Circle, right, which you described, basically, in my opinion, has to do with the Speech Act hype. The Speech Act had already been discovered in the 18th century, basically, but somehow, and it was present in pragmatism. I mean, pragmatism within linguistics, and then it was taken up by analytical philosophy, and that gave it a certain from 1950 to the 70s, a certain boost. And before they then took on other topics again. So that's how they basically, I think that was the main content to give it a certain renaissance. And then the other comment I'd like to make is that, like the Fed and also the US military network around the world, the dominance of analytical philosophy can be explained by American hegemony, right? And that's why a friend of mine calls it D-Day philosophy, right? So he's also a neo-Kantian / Husserlian. Well, he's more an idealist. His name is Ulrich Schödelbauer, but he calls it D-Day philosophy. And I think there's something about it because it was brought to Europe basically as a part of the American dominance. And a lot of very good philosophy was brushed aside and replaced. And now it has become totally scholasticized and sclerotic and Cartesian and materialistic. And also, like Baron Münchhausen, who wants to drag himself out of the swamp on his own hair. They do this by ignoring metaphysics. That's what you said when you say they have no account of logic. That's because they don't think about the metaphysical foundations of their own system in a way. That's just what I would like to add to what you said.
Yes, yeah.
So I would take a third position. I would say that it's not D-Day philosophy. It's more like McDonald's philosophy. In other words, Germany didn't have much productive energy left at the end of the Second World War for obvious reasons. America did, and that strength of America in music and or the English-speaking world, let's say, in music and other areas of culture was mirrored in the strength of English language philosophy. I would say that the analytic philosophy is indeed a social phenomenon, but it's a social phenomenon which is contrasted with continental philosophy, with Foucault, Derrida, Claptrap. And if you look at analytic philosophy and compare it to Foucault, Derrida, Claptrap, it really is much better. It's more coherent. You can have arguments with it, which makes sense, which is what we're doing today. You can't argue with a gigantic nonsense pillow. But then I would add one other factor which Jobst and I have discussed a lot, which is the tendency of analytic philosophy to become a kind of scholasticism.
Yes.
So there are so many young students trying to get PhDs in philosophy that you have to keep inventing new disputes and new tiny variants on existing disputes. And so I couldn't find out how long the longest piece is in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, but I guess it would be of the order of 160 pages for one topic. And that means that we are going wrong somewhere. We're not, and I think we're inevitably going wrong if we somehow fail to narrow the market for PhDs in philosophy or find alternative applications for PhDs in philosophy, which is what we're actually doing in Buffalo. So we're building a new PhD program for philosophy students, which prepares them for jobs in other areas.
So maybe just out of fairness, so the comparison with nonsense, which is anti-rationalism by Heidegger pupils like Derrida and Foucault, who had the explicit goal to bring down Western philosophy, right? Especially Derrida as an Algerian, he explicitly said it. I think that's not a fair comparison. So you have to compare analytic philosophy with something serious, like for example, phenomenology, right? And I mean, if I look, I've been reading now because I had to prepare a lecture that I will give next week in Budweis about Husserl. I read some contemporary phenomenologists. You can also claim that they have to some extent become scholasticized, right? Because they go around and round in Husserl's writings and find new details and recombine them. So there's also a scholastic character to this, which you can also find, for example, in Lutheran orthodoxy in theology for 200 years, you know, where discipline went in circles all the time, and the debates became tinier and tinier, and so you have this in phenomenology as well. However, the comparison is still fairer because at least phenomenologists try to give an account of the source of all entities of the entire ontology, which analytical philosophers don't do. So that's the only reply to Barry, but otherwise I agree with everything.
Yes. Yes, and just to elaborate a little more on what Jobst and Barry were both saying, I think that the analytic tradition, the post-classical analytic tradition, as it were, supercharged itself by aligning itself explicitly or implicitly with the military industrial complex, and took on features of that complex and what we would now call neoliberalism. And so professional philosophy and its scholasticism are driven by a need to produce widgets. And the widgets are a great many articles on narrower and narrower topics. And as for the distinction between the analytic philosophy and so-called continental philosophy, some of the people I've been working with did word searches, as to when the term continental philosophy arose, and it wasn't until the 1980s. I mean, there was some anticipations. A.J. Ayer had at some point talked about a continental style of philosophy or something in the 1950s, but it didn't become coin of the realm until the 1980s. And since then, it's meant primarily nonsense philosophy that we don't like. So that's incoherent, it's not bound by logical norms. And then what they do is they shove everything that's not in mainstream analytic philosophy into that tradition, including Kantian philosophy, including the more rigorous forms of phenomenology and any other kind of philosophy that they don't like. And so I think it's perfectly reasonable for someone to say, now, wait a minute, there's perfectly well-guided, logically guided, motivated, substantive philosophy coming from the phenomenological tradition, and then earlier from the Kantian tradition, that could stand up, or at least should have an option or the opportunity to offer responses to the standard criticisms that all such philosophy is nonsensical, not just psychologistic, but worse than that, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And yet, in philosophy departments, everybody who's not an analytic philosopher just gets shunted into a teaching stream, and they get to publish on their own little thing. But they're not allowed to have authority where central philosophical topics are concerned. And when you offer them, so I wrote, a 4-volume monster called The Rational Human Condition, but I don't think any analytic philosophers have paid any attention to it. Maybe nobody has anyway, but any analytic philosophers have paid any attention to it whatsoever, even though in some of those books I tried very hard to connect to the mainstream analytic tradition, engage in a dialogue, but they don't want a dialogue. They just, they'd rather refute by avoidance.
I think I would change your account a little bit. And I'm guessing that the phrase continental philosophy arose in America. North America,
Yes.
not in departments of philosophy, but in departments of English literature or French studies or cinema studies and so forth.
Yeah.
And there it truly does mean the following: Heidegger and everything which followed Heidegger. And it doesn't mean good bits of continental philosophy, because they didn't know anything about the good bits of continental philosophy, because they didn't know anything about philosophy. So we have a department of comparative literature here in Buffalo.
Yeah.
Most of what they teach is the continental philosophy, but they don't teach it as philosophy. They don't know what philosophy is. And I'll get myself into trouble now, but I sometimes describe it as the activities of people who collect sails and sailing regalia, but they don't know about water. They just are interested in sails, really interesting sails. Here, this one's triangular, came from Tübingen and stuff.
I mean,
Anyway.
yes, it's with regard to the sources one can use that are misbranded as continental philosophy, because there is now a negative branding which is used like a stigma, right? So this term is now, even if you're right how it originated, it's now used like a stigma. That's what you want to say, Robert. And so what we use, Barry and I use very, very often is Scheler, Cassirer, also Arnold Gehlen. I don't know whether you ever read him. His book Man is absolutely fabulous, because it draws on the neo-Kantianism, but also Schopenhauer and Scheler. So it's a great combination of those. Nikolai Hartmann. These are all great thinkers of these traditions in this field of the 1920s and 1930s. And so there are others, and we use a lot. I also would like sometimes more in our collaboration with Barry to use Kant, but he's not so prone to it. But basically, there is a very rich tradition that can be used very fruitfully. But it's at the moment it's not fashionable, and there are analytic philosophy dominance is kind of institutionally supported.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that criticizing professionalism and academicism in contemporary philosophy also gets at the core of what is left of the analytic tradition. And so showing that a certain way of approaching the socialization of philosophy and the socialization of graduate students, and criticizing that, pointing out that it's working according to neoliberal models and so on, is a way of undermining it, even more basic, really, than addressing their arguments. Because if you come in at the level of their arguments and their debates, you're already accepting their starting points, whereas you may want to reject those starting points from the get-go. Yeah.
This brings me to a very important aspect. We didn't mention it yet, and that's the teleological undercurrent in analytic philosophy. So they have a 19th century style of secular teleology, meaning that they believe in a certain linear type of progress, like the neoliberals. That basically there is a progress model that is ignorant of the conditio humana, right? That human beings are in a way ontologically restricted. Theologians ignore this. They basically extrapolate certain outer progress that is also now abating, by the way, and that is economic and technological progress also philosophically. And I think that's a big metaphysical weakness, and also an aspect of analytical philosophy that is not highlighted so often, but it's called in German Fortschrittsgläubigkeit. So it means a very uncritical belief in progress, and that's what they kind of have, and it replaces the older Christian belief in salvation at the end of time, in a way. You see what I mean?
So give me some examples. Who commits this uncritical belief sin?
So explicit, I don't think there's a lot of this explicitly, right? But where you have it, of course, very strong is in Richard Rorty. Now you could argue that Richard Rorty is not the clearest representative of analytic philosophy, right? You can also see him as pragmatist, but certainly there is a stream of analytic philosophy in his thinking. Even worse is, of course, Jürgen Habermas. Now, you could also argue he's not mainly an analytical philosopher, but more a Western Marxist and pragmatist. But certainly in him, you have this as well, So these are the two most important ones. Okay, you can say they are politically socialists, but I still think that their core view, their theory of truth, is very much also informed by analytic philosophy, and so I believe that they are easier examples. But the more subtle ones are those where you can sense in the writings that they believe that progress can be achieved by these endless debates. I think the entire Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has a bit of the smell of teleology, but it would require a more thorough work
So every science has this kind of teleology, does it not?
I don't think
science claims that it's going to make progress. I mean, every noble and established science, physics, for instance.
yes, but the question is whether you do this with a, Husserl of course says this as well, but he says it's an infinitesimal effort, right?
Yeah.
And he clearly sees the limits as well. And the same Kant he wrote 3 books about the limits of disciplines, right? The 3 critiques, which are all totally concerned with understanding the limits of the scientific effort. So I believe that you can believe that it's possible to work on the edifice of science in a systematic way. And I think the 3 of us all want to do this and share this. And with many others, but I am at least, and I believe the 2 of you as well, are also critical with regard to the overall possibilities of science. And I think this is sometimes lacking in the field because of an unwillingness to look at the own metaphysical foundations.
Mm-hmm. I think 2 other examples of this sort of naive, uncritical commitment to a certain kind of progress would be, say, David Chalmers and Timothy Williamson. Both of whom, are committed to a model of progress that is a reflection of the natural sciences in particular. And so Chalmers thinks, and as do great many analytic philosophers, that an understanding of consciousness, whether sort of representational consciousness, or he's more worried about qualitative consciousness, but will be yielded by the natural sciences. So there's the easy problem of consciousness. And then the hard problem is somehow figuring out how the kind of qualia can exist in a world that's fully mechanized and fully material. And Williamson thinks, well, we turn over our conception of philosophical progress not only to the natural sciences, but to the formal sciences, and in particular to various forms of modal logic, and that we can get a metaphysics, we can derive a metaphysics directly from those. And so, and they're not challenging the sciences at all. And so one way of characterizing an anti-analytic project would be to look into the foundations of the natural and formal sciences, to criticize them, to try to provide a general account of the foundations of logic, foundations of mathematics, foundations of physics and chemistry and biology and so on, and then offer those as alternatives. You could be pro-science without being scientistic. And that point in itself, shows that Chalmers and Williamson are, as it were, barking up the wrong tree, but by hitching, they take on the aura of success just by hitching their wagons to scientific progress.
So one very important aspect of this that Barry and I have analyzed in the 2nd edition of the AI book, but that just appeared, but also in papers we work on about the ontology of physics, is the following. So if you look at quantum physics, right, the mathematical models that are used in quantum physics, they don't have instances in reality. They're just coupled via the magnitudes to the real entities that get measured. And the real entities that get measured, like for example the spin of a particle, is not an instance of a universal, but it's a bound ideality in Husserl's language. And the mathematical model describing it is then a free ideality, which is really just a model of it. But what those people do is that they confound the model of reality with reality itself. So they look at these models like for example, integrals in quantum field theory or tensors in general theory of relativity. And then they think that they can learn something about the world by looking at this. But this is fundamentally wrong, because what these models do is that they teach us something about the way we think about nature, but not about how nature is. Because, for example, an entangled photon equation, wave equation describing the entangled photon or superimposed photons, these wave equations, they have no ontological substance with regard to what happens in nature. We can't understand them. We can just use them to calculate phenomena, but they don't give us an understanding of how the world works. They give us an understanding of how our mind works, and also enables us to build machines. And this they don't see. They take the equations of mathematics as being physics, right? Chalmers does this all the time. And that's very naive and leads into all kinds of absurd conclusions, like that, for example, nature is made of bits, right? Or reality is made of bits.
Yes. Yes, and so the wag, or rather the juggernaut to which Chalmers and Williamson and mainstream analytic tradition more generally have hitched themselves is itself questionable in various ways. And so, they're working within the framework of an uncritical natural science and uncritical, I think, approaches to, the formal sciences. And yet those need to be analyzed and criticized. And that can be done from outside. I think it can be done from a broadly Kantian point of view, but you could approach it from a phenomenological point of view as well, and offer better accounts of the sciences than are dominant in the sciences themselves. And that would constitute a kind of genuine movement forward. Not just naive progress, but real critical progress.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Barry. Let me try and be a little bit more generous towards our analytic friends. So they have these methods rooted in logic and in logical investigations in the nature of mathematics and so forth. And then they have physics, on the other hand. Physics is quantum physics I'm thinking of now. Quantum physics is very difficult to understand. So let's build a model using our mathematico-logical tools of what we think quantum physics is all about, and then we will test that model against the achievements of quantum physics in making predictions and so forth. As such models are being built. They're not necessarily crazy. They tend to be associated with over-optimism because they inevitably bring about a simplification of what quantum physics is all about. But it's not, what they're doing is not wrong. We don't know whether it's wrong until we see where it leads. So it could lead gradually to better and better models, which do indeed serve the purposes of bringing about an understanding of quantum physics.
I disagree with this, because I believe that the models of quantum physics are essentially not understandable with common sense, compatible with common sense reality, and that we have now enough experiments that show that the correspondence theory that was proposed by Born and others in the 1920s breaks down, right? So we have the example in our book, in the new chapter 7 about physics, about the Pfleger-Mandel experiment, which is an experiment where two lasers are manipulated in a way that they can both contribute the light waves or the quantum waves they produce to creating one common beam of light with mirrors and manipulations. And basically, and you have to put them in phase, and it's a difficult experiment. And then when you attenuate the energy to an extent that they create only one single photon, this one single photon still creates an interference pattern upon measurement, like a wave does. But how can one single entity that creates only one detection signal create at the same time an interference pattern and still be a wave? So that means that the provenance of this particle, so there's an equation describing this, and this means that the causal provenance of this particle is unclear. So it has no causation anymore, which is one of the core principles of matter in classical metaphysics and physics. And then also it has no mereological sense anymore, because it's at the same time made of half of a photon from one laser and half of a photon from another one, or half a wave, so it loses all properties of matter. And so with this, it's clear that the correspondence of quantum physics with classical physics that can still be found in Rutherford scattering, for example, breaks totally down. And so I think that it's a vain exercise to try to use philosophy to clarify this, but that we have to accept this and start understanding that here we create with technical means a setup that makes it impossible for us to understand what's going on with common sense in our view of the natural world. And I think attempts to try to philosophize around this have been now going on since 60 or 70 years, and they have led to nothing. The literature on interpreting quantum mechanics is terrible. It's a huge mess. It now contains hundreds of thousands of papers, and they don't lead to any deeper understanding. I think, and that's because those who do this type of work, they fail to see that this is the wrong question to ask. So that's my point of view on this, Barry.
Yeah. Well, one thing one might say is that a sort of an important, perhaps even essential difference between analytic philosophy and those of us who are sympathetic to analytic methods, but not to the substance, let's say, of analytic philosophy, is that explanations have to bottom out in manifest reality, or the phenomena, or, as Husserl might say, the things themselves, and that they can't be just described accurately in merely abstract formal models. They have to be available to us in experience. And that, that's a Kantian thought as well. All our cognition begins in experience. It doesn't follow that it all arises from it. And so experience can be, conceptualized and theorized and refined, and given, general explanations that illuminate experience, but it's all got to come back to, coffee cups and, ordinary phenomena. Whereas I don't think that the analytic tradition, there are some common sense streams, Austin's philosophy, ordinary language philosophy introduced, a common sense stream, later Wittgenstein and so on. But that was against the grain, I think, of the mainstream tradition. And nowadays, analytic philosophers, typically the ones I worked with, they didn't even think later Wittgenstein was a philosopher. They just said, oh, philosophical investigations, that's Continental philosophy. That means they didn't like it and it was incoherent or something. So that thought that you might say, yes, so here's a similarity amongst certain forms of Kantianism, certain forms of phenomenology, realistic phenomenology, later Wittgenstein, and certain forms of ordinary language philosophy. They're all committed to the grounding of our theories and our reflections in manifest reality, whether reflections on our own capacities for consciousness and intentionality, or on the evidence provided to us by our senses.
So there's one very strong argument that Barry and I make in our on AI. If you look at the most powerful language formalisms that there are to express what natural language does using logic, then you have Montague grammar and generative grammar, and they basically they allow to express much more than simple modal logic or simple first order logic. But they can only many language phenomena they cannot express. And that's not by chance, but that's because formalisms cannot cope with the output of complex systems. And so because the human mind is a complex system, it creates a type of output that overwhelms the formalization capabilities. So that's an argument from thermodynamics that says, and that we use in our book, complex systems have certain properties, and these properties, and Kant would like this argument very much, they overwhelm the formalization abilities, and therefore they can express something that we cannot put into a Cartesian coordinate system, for which we cannot define a function or an operator, no matter what effort we take, because there is no regularity that allows us to do this, right? So the formalization only works with certain regularities. There we have the laws of logic, and we can then have different flavors of logic. But when we get outside this field of regularities, and that happens most of the time when human beings act and think and speak, then this formalization fails. And I think this is an argument that this entire movement fails to appreciate. And it's quite strange, because the argument comes right out of physics, out of thermodynamics. And it looks like they have only appreciating a very small part of physics that gives them this illusion that everything can be formalized and Cartesianized. But they fail to look at the results of physics that basically show that this cannot be done.
So this is the optimism that you described earlier, Jobst, the idea that we're on a upward-facing dynamic, things will get better and better, our theories will get better and better.
They will. I don't disagree with that.
But there will always be limits.
Yes.
In physics as in philosophy.
Yes.
And people don't like to talk about limits.
No, especially if those limits are bound up with the human condition and the human standpoint, and in particular, the sort of primitive spontaneity of our consciousness and this primitive spontaneity of human intentionality and intelligence. And if that can't, there's no machine that can be substituted, I think, for that. And that recognition as a limit of certain kinds of investigation would serve as a signpost or as a guide for philosophy, not only philosophy, but the sciences that are dealing with these facts and phenomena.
So what would David Chalmers say if you suggested to him that he'd respect the limits of human intelligence and of consciousness and of freedom and so forth?
I'm not sure what he'd say. It would be clever, whatever it was he said. But it might have something to do with, here we are living in a virtual reality, and he'd just sort of go on that shtick. Or he would flip back, as he does, to Vienna Circle style, modes of argument, constructive empiricism in the logical empiricist tradition. I don't know whether he would have a good response. I mean, I haven't seen anything he's written that answers the question, what is the nature and status of logic given the logocentric predicament? I just don't think he's grappled with that.
So when you have a scholasticized field, and we have this very clearly, I mean, using zombies to analyze consciousness, I mean, it all begins already with this. It shows the level of scholasticization, what you have to do, and what has always happened when science became scholasticized is that they started to exclude outsiders that criticized it. And they started to become very exclusive and very focused on their own school. So you can see this. I give you a very extreme example that you could not see in the US. So if you go into Tübingen, which was, of course, always one of the greatest faculties of theology, in the time when theology was the dominating humanity, a dominating science, and you go to the basement of the library, you have there tens of thousands of leather-bound books from the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. And these are the products of hundreds of professors who worked in the German-speaking area on Lutheran orthodoxy. And they were complete. It was a closed shop. They didn't accept anything else. It's always the same topics, refined more and more and more. And you can open these books, and it's astonishing how extremely thoughtful and differentiated they were. So they were not stupid, but they were totally wasting their time. They were excluding anyone who wanted to test a new pattern and paradigm. And it actually was such a closed shop that it held water until the end of the 18th century. And only then, with the Enlightenment age, it was broken up, and then the new theology emerged with Schleiermacher. But it took 250 years where they were completely closing themselves down, and no progress was possible anymore. And I think that you see this also when you discuss with scholasticized analytic philosophers, that they just exclude you. They brand you as something that is bad or continental or whatever. And then they refuse the discussion, which is, of course, a sign of inner death, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, no, I would take a more modest view. I would say it's our job to open a discussion. In other words, it's our job to find a way of speaking that they will understand and take seriously, but which will at the same time be a deep criticism of some aspect of their work. So
yes, they're very good at refuting by avoidance, as I said earlier. And so it might be. So here's a sort of hopeful thought, and that is that as the analytic tradition really does continue to, if it does continue to crumble, they might be then more open to people offering views like ours, which open their tradition to earlier traditions, rethinking of the Kantian tradition, perhaps, or rethinking the phenomenological tradition. They might become more open to that sort of thing. Frankly, I don't see it particularly.
I don't see it because there are too many of them, and there are no gods anymore. Right. John Searle is the last of the great philosophers in the Anglo-Saxon tradition. There were gods still a few years ago in the European tradition. Derrida was a god. He could change the way philosophy moved forward. We don't have gods anymore. We have lots and lots of little people.
Yes.
And we could maybe even convince some of those little people to take seriously some of the things that we say. But it wouldn't make any difference. It would just be more scholastic splits and splits and splits.
Yes.
I mean,
that was my optimistic version.
Yeah.
In a way, this must mean more. I think what it means is a cultural. It's a symptom of a general cultural crisis of the West. It's undoubtable that the West is in a cultural crisis, and in a cultural crisis, and you have this. Barry, you self pointed me to Brentano's work on the crisis, on the cycle of philosophy, right? By the way, which is something you omitted, Robert, in your account of analytical philosophy, of course, the sources in Austrian philosophy, right? That Wittgenstein and also Frege and Russell, they go, of course, they have also basis in Austrian philosophy, but and also, yeah, oh God, yeah, and I think it is a symptom. Yeah, a symptom of a symptom of
Tarski.
Yeah, he was more car and car than Austrian, but I agree.
Yeah, well, we have the whole car and car.
Yeah, I agree. But what I'm trying to say is that that there's a general crisis now in the Western culture, and I think analytical philosophy and also this postmodernism, right? To now find a different name for Derrida and Foucault, they are in a way both symptoms of a crisis of the culture and of lack of vitality, because vitality means also the ability to do a renaissance, right? So in a way, what you are doing, Robert, by recurring to Kant is kind of a renaissance activity. And of course one can criticize this, but usually renaissances, and that again ties into the model, in the four phases of philosophy model, they are very useful because what is valuable of a tradition that has been forgotten is being rediscovered and continued. And so this usually is fruitful. But at the moment, I don't think we are in the cultural situation in the West where this can take on the majority of thinkers.
Yeah, a suggestion that I've made is that since one core piece of the problem is the institutionalization of professional academic philosophy, that productive ideas could come from outside the professional academy. And Barry and I have talked about this as well, and he suggested that professional philosophy should, as it were, look sideways to other disciplines already existing within the professional academy and try to create a more comprehensive notion, a more flexible, open-textured notion of philosophy. But I've wondered whether, even if you brought in a lot of other departments, you would still be driven by the military industrial digital complex and the need to publish a lot of stuff on narrower and narrower topics, discussing less and less content. And so on the other hand, if Jobst is right and it's a general crisis of modern contemporary culture, then moving outside to the larger social whole won't escape that either.
So Barry's and my collaboration can be seen in this sense, right? So I come out from, though I have a good philosophical education, I come from outside the academic world. I make a living in the economy, and I'm also more from the sciences, right? So I'm a mathematician and biochemist, and so I think, but philosophically interested, and so I think it can work if it's done well. but it requires, of course, also willingness and understanding of philosophy and a love for philosophy. Or philosophy means, of course, love for wisdom. So it requires this love, right? And then it can work. So I see this not only with Barry's and my collaboration, but also with the way Barry worked with other colleagues from the sciences in his life when focusing on applied ontology. So I think it can work. But it's certainly not the recipe to save philosophy. And the second
Right.
aspect to how I want to answer to your suggestion is that the biggest mistake that was made after World War II everywhere in the West was to broaden higher academic education to the masses. So and I'm not the only one who said this, but Stove says it as well. What's his first name? The Australian philosopher?
David Stove.
David Stove says this as well. So it's basically it would have been better to maintain a very small proportion in the higher academic education, and then to have a second broad academic education for the masses to educate all the engineers and lawyers and teachers that we need, but their teachers would not have to publish, right? And I think that would then basically clean up this big mess that now we have this enshittification of scientific publishing, because there are so many people with a low IQ are now having tenure positions, and they have an IQ even below 130. And then what do you want to expect? There is just a hard limit to the complexity of the thoughts that they can formulate and think. By the way, that's also why I think why postmodernism has caught on, because there are so many relatively stupid professors who are not clever enough to see how bad it works, how bad it is, right? Because they don't have the sufficient abstraction and deduction capabilities for this. So I think this is also an aspect that the mass university, not only the mass students, but also the mass teachers and mass faculties have brought down the average level of thinking in the academic world.
Yes, and in that way, I suppose moving the core of philosophy, narrowing it and moving it outside the professional academy would help as well, because then, only a few, there would be a smaller group, those who truly love philosophy and were somehow capable, able to survive by either working in the larger economy or having someone support them, on these projects that would, they have no cash value and they have no status value inside the professional academy. And so therefore, it seems to me they could be done with greater rigor and,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, we could take over 1 or 2 universities and have philosophy departments in those universities, which satisfy the desire for coherent argument and so forth.
What you describe, Robert, has happened many times in the history of philosophy. David Hume was not part of a philosophic academic department.
Yeah.
Neither was Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant worked first in geophysics, right? And then he started doing philosophy out of interest, but he was not primarily professional philosopher in the first half life of his career. And there are many great examples for this. And myself, the reason the way I'm doing philosophy is I'm self-funded. I make my living, and then I have, thanks to good circumstance, I always find enough time to do philosophy, and then I can speak out about topics and analyze topics in a way that I could not if I would be part of the establishment. And I think that's very advantageous. And Barry is the same. He can do it because he has created a new discipline, and now he basically has all his, how can I say, namely applied ontology, and he has all his reputation there, and therefore he can also be more free. And I think that's what's needed.
Yeah. So my idea is that the whole of philosophy should become applied ontology. That we build a really powerful ontological framework and force everyone to use its terminology. And then we stop having arguments with each other because we associate different meanings with the same term.
Yeah.
So that's a Buffalo Circle now.
Right. with a supplementary lexicon from the Kantians, I think.
Yeah, I would allow that on the side.
But in any case, decentering philosophy from mainstream analytic philosophy, mainstream models of philosophy in higher education, bound up with teaching and productivity demands and so on. I think that would be, and we're three of us and other people are examples of it. And so more and more of that, I think, would be a very good thing for philosophy and beyond, beyond the analytic tradition.
So I'd like to get back once more to this term of objectification brought up by Gary Marcus. What he means is that more and more texts which are published in scientific journals are created by large language models now. And the fact that they pass review, right? And that's also an aspect that the reviewing system, the peer reviewing system cannot work anymore if you have too many idiots inside it, right? It can't work. It needs not only intelligent people, but also people with good values. And so the old model that made science so successful in the 19th century and the early 20th century were small circles of people with very high ethics and who were very intelligent, and then the system could work. It always created problems. So Hans Krebs' citrate cycle couldn't be published at first because nobody believed in. The same was Einstein. But in the end, it somehow worked out. But the standards were very different. I think this objectification is not only happening because of large language models are used, but also because the standards are eroding, and that is not a good sign, right?
And what do you see as an alternative to that? I mean, one possibility is just get rid of the peer review system altogether and have people publish their work and critically evaluated. It would be messy and perhaps might not, generate
in physics, they've been doing it for decades now with arXiv, and it works pretty well. So papers get published there. If they contain mistakes, the authors are panned, and then they have to retract the papers or correct them, or they get ignored. And in a way, it's like an evolutionary process where the good papers somehow then survive and also get republished in official physics journals. So I think this works, but it also has weaknesses, especially in the parts of physics that have now detached themselves from empirical verification, namely string theory and quantum loop dynamics or quantum loop theory. There are now problems which also lead to a certain scholastification. But overall, I think the peer review system as it is now, in combination with this, publishing industry, is very toxic and inhibits the advancements of science, and also creates a huge pool of useless science that doesn't contribute anything. And so I think the system must be changed, but it can only happen, I think, if it gets into a bigger crisis, even as it is than it is now.
Right.
So I like the arXiv model too. And it's a bit of a pity that David Chalmers didn't replicate the arXiv model when he set up Phil Papers. So Phil Papers serves more the storehouse of old bits and pieces of publishing model, which is different from the arXiv model. But there is an arXiv model also in medicine, but what counts in medicine is peer review, because there are so many people who are making claims about medicinal products and so forth who turn out not to satisfy the needs of peer review. So we still need peer review in medicine. We probably need it in physics.
I mean, we need peer review in medicine if the papers are supposed to feed into therapies or diagnostics.
Right.
Then we also need agencies, state agencies, and as we saw in the last 5 years, those have also lost to some extent the ability to be a barrier against approving procedures that are harmful. So it's not so easy, even in medicine.
So would anyone like to summarize the results of this?
Well, I could say, this is more a repetition of what I said before, that for various reasons, mainstream post-classical analytic philosophy is a Potemkin village. It's got a nice shiny front, but behind the front, it is, I think, going down into the ash heap of history, crashing and burning. But the hopeful side is that there are people like us and other philosophers who have serious worries about that tradition and are offering non-analytic philosophy alternatives that borrow from analytic methods and also have a more substantive grounding let's say in, human phenomena or manifest reality, are knowledgeable of the sciences or attentive to the sciences without being scientistic. And so there's some hope for progress in the face of a social institutional behemoth that seems indestructible in a way.
So I agree with all of that, surprisingly.
So do I. Thanks a lot, Robert. It was nice to meet you and a
Yeah, it's
very
great to
nice
meet you too,
discussion.
Jobst. Yeah,
We should talk more about Kantianism.
we should.
You can do that in the privacy of your own home.
Yes, we do this after another time.
Yes,
because I'd be very interested to discuss a bit more with you, because I was raised completely in the Kantian tradition from really my childhood onwards, but
You're
there
a
are parts,
German.
yes, and there were parts of Kantianism which I now disagree with, especially the ethics part. And I think we should, but you use this, and I think that would be very interesting to have another discussion, but Barry may not want to participate because he has an allergy against Kant.
Right.
If I may say so, Barry.
Yes, we definitely should have that discussion, and Barry doesn't have to. He doesn't have to take part.
So I'll write you a few lines on this, and then we can start from there. But it was super nice to meet you.
Yeah,
Barry told me what a great guy you are, and I can completely confirm this. And I hope it wasn't boring for you.
No, not on the contrary. Yeah, it's not only enlightening but enlivening. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. It was a big pleasure. Barry, thanks so much for organizing. This was just great.
And thank you both. I will now switch things off.
All right. Take care.
We'll be in contact. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.